Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you back to the second semester in our lecture series, The United States and World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasner Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank Richard Krasner and the generous sponsors behind him for supporting this lecture series. And I have the great pleasure tonight to introduce Richard Krasner to you. He was able to make it, and thank you very much for coming and for all the help and support you are giving to us, my chair in particular, but also to this lecture series, The United States in World Affairs. As always, I would also like to thank the Department of History, of course, and our great Center for European Studies for also their help and support. In a few days' time, the lecture today will be available on our YouTube channel and also on the UNC websites. All our previous talks and also the talks in our Ambassadors Forum are available on our YouTube channel and can be viewed at any day or night. Whenever you would like to view it, please don't hesitate to do so. It is a great and particularly great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor William Leuchtenberg today. As many of you know, Bill Leuchtenberg has been a pillar of the UNC History Department for many, many years, actually for over 20 years. And it is, of course, a tremendous pleasure to welcome Bill Leuchtenberg today. William Leuchtenberg is a William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor Emeritus at UNC-Chapel Hill. Bill Leuchtenberg is one of the nation's most eminent and distinguished presidential historians. He is a leading scholar of the life and politics of Franklin Roosevelt and other 20th century American presidents. He is the author of more than a dozen books. Having taught for 30 years at Columbia University and for 20 years at UNC-Chapel Hill, William Leuchtenberg recently celebrated a very round birthday. He is now a mere 90 years old. Bill also taught at a number of European universities, as well as at universities in Russia, in Israel and South Africa. He also was the holder of the Harmsworth Chair at Oxford University. William Leuchtenberg was president of the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and other distinguished historical societies. On a personal note, I would just like to add that I read Bill Leuchtenberg's Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and His Unfinished Century, America Since 1900, as an undergraduate student in Cologne, Germany, and that is now quite a few years ago, I have to admit. And I benefited greatly from both of these books, and they certainly started my interest in American contemporary history. It is therefore a great honor to introduce William Leuchtenberg here to you today. After all, it is quite justified to say that as hardly any other historian, William Leuchtenberg has greatly shaped the writing of the history of 20th century America. Today, Bill Leuchtenberg will talk to us about US presidents and foreign policy, from Harry Truman to Barack Obama. There will be time for questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to present to you William Leuchtenberg.
Lectures that Professor Lares has arranged, and it's a remarkable series of people he's bringing in here, will deal with an array of subjects. And what I want to do today is to provide a narrative, a storyline into which the coming lectures can be fit. Pardon me a second. Late on an April afternoon in 1945, the Vice President of the United States, Harry Truman, was presiding in the Senate over a debate on a treaty. When the debate ended, shortly before sunset, he made his way over to the office of the Speaker of the House for their usual afternoon round of bourbon and branch water. No sooner had he arrived than the Vice President was told to call the White House. The President's press secretary, he was informed, wanted him to come down right away, quickly and quietly. Truman put down the phone, raced through an underground tunnel in the Capitol, and sped to the White House. When he got there, Mrs. Roosevelt came up to him, put an arm on his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Franklin D. Roosevelt had died that afternoon in Warm Springs, Georgia. After a moment of shock, Truman recovered himself to ask Mrs. Roosevelt, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." That was an odd remark to make to someone who had just ascended to the highest office in the land. But Truman grasped immediately that he was indeed in trouble, for so totally had FDR embodied who the president was that it seemed incomprehensible that anyone else could be president of the United States. When on Truman's first morning in office, a messenger sounded the traditional cry, "The president is coming out," and Truman emerged, a secretary, momentarily stunned, burst into tears, then explained, "I thought he meant the president, President Roosevelt." Little about the Missourian impressed the country as being of presidential caliber. Harry S. Truman appeared to be a hinterland Mr. Nobody. Symptomatically, the middle initial of his name did not stand for anything. He was and remained the only 20th century American president never to have spent a day in college. Conservatives viewed him with contempt, and liberals thought him an awful come down from FDR. A prominent liberal, Fiorello LaGuardia, said of Truman, "I look at him and I say to myself, yes, he is in Roosevelt's chair. Yes, he is. Yes, he is." And then I say, "Oh, no, no, my God, it's impossible." European chancelleries found it hard to comprehend why, at such a critical juncture, the United States was placing itself in the hands of a man so transparently unqualified. A biographer has written, when Truman became president, he had no experience in diplomacy, little travel abroad, no record of consistent engagement with diplomatic issues while in the Senate. Winston Churchill later noted, "The deadly hiatus between the fading of President Roosevelt's strength and the growth of President Truman's grip of world problems." He concluded, "The indispensable political direction was lacking at the moment when it was most needed." While vice president, Truman had been kept woefully ill-informed. In the 82 days he served under Roosevelt, Truman recalled, "I don't think I saw him but twice." Truman told his daughter, "He never did talk to me confidentially about the war, or about foreign affairs, or about what he had in mind for the peace after the war." Truman inherited the presidency without ever having met the ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman. He did not even know his Secretary of State. He had not been privy to the negotiations at Yalta, knew nothing about vexing issues such as the Polish boundaries, and had been kept in the dark on the atomic bomb. When at the close of the first cabinet meeting, Henry Stimson took him aside to inform him that the government had a secret weapon of almost unbelievable destructive power that Congress did not know about, the Secretary of War spoke so guardedly that the new president did not understand what he was being told. Not until 2 weeks had gone by did Stimson feel it was safe to let the President of the United States know that America had the atomic bomb, which Truman was going to have to decide shortly whether and when to drop. Night after night, Truman sat up all hours poring over State Department documents, badly straining his eyes in the effort to catch up. He began his presidency with an awareness that most of the country viewed him as nothing more than a stand-in for the late president. And he vowed to do all he could to continue Roosevelt's policies. 5 months after he took office, he was still writing Eleanor Roosevelt, "I never think of anyone as the president, but Mr. Roosevelt." Truman's deference to Eleanor Roosevelt went well beyond personal solicitude. He started his presidency, one account noted, by regularly phoning his predecessor's widow to find out what he would have done about this or that great problem. Truman, the writer said, consulted Mrs. Roosevelt as he might have consulted a medium. Unexpectedly, though, Truman wound up far freer to formulate his own foreign policy than any other president of the past 2/3 of a century. Now, how could one explain that? 2 ways. First, the very fact that he had so little contact with Roosevelt meant that he'd made no specific commitments and often could not even divine what FDR's policies might have been. Second, more important, the onset of the Cold War created so drastically different a situation that Roosevelt's legacy was tangential, sometimes irrelevant. That did not mean that it was altogether irrelevant. In accounting for why he decided to intervene in Korea, Truman said that on the plane, as he flew to Washington from his home in Missouri, after hearing of the North Korean invasion, he, quote, kept coming back to the 1930s, to Manchuria, to Ethiopia, to the Rhineland, Austria, and finally Munich. I remembered, he said, how each time the democracies failed to act and encouraged the oppressors to keep going ahead. He vowed not to make that mistake in Korea. Truman is so overshadowed by FDR that few Americans realize how many of the institutions of the 21st century conduct of foreign affairs were born in the Truman presidency. The Department of Defense, the authorization for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the National Security Council. Truman is sometimes better appreciated abroad. In 1984, I was invited to Israel to lecture at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in a celebration of the 100th anniversary of Truman's birth. Because Truman is admired for recognizing the new Republic of Israel only 11 minutes after it was founded. During Truman's presidency, he undertook a remarkable number of initiatives. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO, the Korean War, policies embraced in the concept of containment. In Truman's final year as president, Winston Churchill paid a call. The last time you and I sat across the conference table was at Potsdam, Mr. President, Churchill said. Truman grinned. I must confess, sir, I held you in very low regard. I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt. Truman turned white. Churchill went on, I misjudged you badly. Since that time, you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization. In encounters with Churchill, one always has to allow for a certain amount of guff. Having been left so uninformed, when he entered the White House, Truman intended to turn over his office to his successor, General Eisenhower, in a much more systematic fashion. But Eisenhower made that easy passage difficult by denouncing Truman's performance during the 1952 campaign and later. The 1952 Republican platform derided, quote, the negative, futile, immoral policy of containment. And Eisenhower's foreign policy advisor, John Foster Dulles, reproached Truman for treadmill policies which at best might perhaps keep us in the same place until we drop exhausted. Asserting that containment had abandoned countless human beings to despotism, Dulles advocated the liberation of captive peoples behind the Iron Curtain. These words echoed Eisenhower's own views. The American conscience, Eisenhower said, can never know peace until these people are restored again to being masters of their own fate. The extraordinarily ambitious goal of liberation did not seem to square with another Eisenhower policy: restraint on military spending. Mounting deficits caused by excessive expenditures for national defense, Eisenhower warned, would result in a permanent state of mobilization in which our whole democratic way of life would be destroyed. Ignoring protests from generals and admirals, Eisenhower cut more than $5 billion in defense spending from Truman's budget. And over the next 6 years, he slashed the Army by nearly 1 million men. Dulles, as Secretary of State, saw no inconsistency in pledging to roll back the Iron Curtain while reducing military spending, because he anticipated that the peoples of Eastern Europe would be liberated peacefully, simply by America's intensity of moral indignation. The mere announcement, he said, by the United States government that it wants and expects liberation to occur will change in an electrifying way the mood of the captive peoples. As one commentator observed, never before had the illusion of American impotence demanded so much of American diplomacy. Instead of relying upon costly ground forces, Eisenhower gave priority to nuclear weapons and a large air force to deliver them. Though it was cutting back defense spending, the Eisenhower administration claimed that America was achieving greater security by getting more bang for the buck. In January 1954, Dulles spelled out the implication of this new look. The United States, he announced, was placing increased reliance on the deterrent of massive retaliatory power, so that it could strike back instantly by means and at times of our own choosing. The difficulty with massive retaliation, critics objected, was that it escalated every dispute into a possible war of extermination. At worst, it left the government with a choice between surrender and annihilation. Furthermore, it strengthened the position of hardliners in the Kremlin who were pushing for an arms buildup. More bang for the buck, it was feared, would lead to more rubble for the ruble. In a number of ways, Eisenhower took departures that owed nothing to Truman, from sanctioning CIA coups to overturn the governments of Iran and Guatemala, to bringing the world absurdly close to the brink of war over Quemoy and Matsu, insignificant islands so close to the Chinese mainland that they were compared to Staten Island's relation to Manhattan. But Eisenhower did not carry his principal ostensible differences with Truman into action. Though he had charged Truman, who had tried to negotiate an end to the Korean War, with, quote, ignominious bartering with our enemies, without the will to victory, Eisenhower, in 1953, bartered with the enemy to bring about a truce in Korea with no semblance of victory. The settlement left the peninsula divided into two countries approximately along the 38th parallel, just where they'd been at the outbreak of the war, and the Republic of South Korea still facing a menacing neighbor to the north. A year later, when Eisenhower was told that if he did not send military aid to the French in Southeast Asia, Dien Bien Phu would fall, he let it fall. The rhetoric of liberation seemed especially hollow after Dulles, in a 1955 broadcast, told the people of Eastern Europe that if they revolted against Soviet oppression, the United States could be counted on. With such expectations, and with the aid of clandestine CIA operatives, Hungarians rebelled. But when Russia sent in 200,000 troops and thousands of tanks to subdue insurgents equipped only with pathetically primitive weapons, Eisenhower did nothing. He well knew that intervention would mean igniting World War III. Moreover, it was not feasible. Hungary, he said, was as inaccessible as Tibet. While the United States stood idly by, Russia crushed the revolt, killing 40,000 courageous freedom fighters and driving more than 150,000 Hungarians into exile. The Hungarian denouement came in the same week as the Suez Crisis. And when that crisis ended, the British, French, and Israelis were furious with Eisenhower for demanding that they withdraw and for voting at the United Nations with the Soviet Union. Arguably, each of these decisions was wise. Eisenhower was right in ending the Korean War, in refusing to intervene in Southeast Asia, in refraining from going into Hungary, in pursuing a course of moderation in the Middle East. As he was right later in not panicking when, in the Sputnik area, the Soviet Union was able to send dogs into space. But these policies bear no resemblance to the rhetoric of liberation, and alert the historian to take pains not to confuse rhetoric with action. When the dust had settled, Eisenhower had not departed considerably from Truman's policy of containment. Still, when Eisenhower turned his office over to John F. Kennedy, who won in 1960 in another changeover of political parties, Eisenhower walked Kennedy over to a globe, pointed at Laos, and told him that there America might have to fight. And he bequeathed Kennedy a foolhardy scheme to support an invasion of Cuba that was expected to expel Fidel Castro. Every president imagines that when he enters the White House, he will write on a clean slate when he sets out to formulate his foreign policy. But the experience of Kennedy prompts us to recognize the degree to which each president may be trapped by his predecessor. On taking office, Kennedy felt that Ike's plans for the Bay of Pigs were too far advanced for him to call off the invasion, a decision he soon bitterly regretted. It's also true, though, that for Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs imbroglio was not altogether uncongenial. The Kennedy era is thought of today, at least in America, as the golden age of peace and prosperity. In fact, Kennedy was a militant Cold Warrior, determined to be much more aggressive than Eisenhower. During the 1960 campaign, Kennedy had declared, "I run for the presidency because I do not want it said that the years when our generation held political power were the years when America began to slip. I don't want historians writing in 1970 to say that the balance of power in the 1950s and 60s began to turn against the United States." I've heard the excuses, but I believe not in America that is first if, first but, first when, but first period. The first vehicle in space was called Sputnik, not Vanguard. The first passengers to return safely from outer space were named Strelka and Belka, not Rover or Fido. I want to be known as the president who not only held back the communist tide, but who also advanced the cause of freedom and rebuilt American prestige. And when he became president, the Cuban Missiles Crisis brought the world the closest to a nuclear holocaust that has ever been. After that frightening confrontation was resolved, however, Kennedy returned to a policy of détente in creating the hotline and negotiating the test ban. To gauge how much Kennedy changed in fewer than 3 years, we need only contrast his inaugural address of 1961 with his American University address of 1963. In his inaugural address, Kennedy said, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, oppose any foe to assure the survival of liberty." He spoke ominously of being at a time of maximum danger, and he made a point of saying, "The graves of Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe." By contrast, in 1963, at American University, he urged, "Let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union." It was imperative, he declared, not to see only a distorted, desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible. In the final analysis, he concluded, "Our most common link is that we all inhabit the same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal." Despite these sentiments, Kennedy, in the very last speech of his life in Fort Worth, Texas, reaffirmed his commitment to the Cold War. And he left Lyndon Johnson the legacy of intervention in Vietnam. And Johnson, in his gargantuan way, greatly expanded. Everything LBJ did was jumbo-sized. Not long after he took office, following the murder of Jack Kennedy, the New York Times said, "Everyone in Washington is acting as though Johnson is 12 feet tall," when we all know he's only 9 feet tall. An apocryphal story circulated that when Chancellor Earhart visited Johnson at the ranch, he thought to flatter him by saying, "I understand, Mr. President, that you were born in a log cabin and rose to greatness from those humble circumstances." And, the story goes, Johnson replied, "No, Chancellor, you are confusing me with Abraham Lincoln. I was born in a manger." The story is apocryphal, but Johnson's record in Vietnam is not. There, he increased the number of American soldiers from the 16,000 at the end of the Kennedy era to more than 500,000, with commensurate fatalities on both sides. Johnson handed the Vietnam escalation on to Richard Nixon, who fancied himself a master of realpolitik, His national security advisor and subsequently Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, had in fact written his Harvard PhD dissertation on Metternich and Castlereagh. Nixon's reconfiguration of big power diplomacy led to the opening of China. But Nixon has been excessively praised for reaching out to the Kremlin and for ending the Vietnam War. The détente with Russia was short-lived, and 1/3 of the deaths in Vietnam occurred under Nixon, who took longer to end the Vietnam conflict than Lincoln had to fight the Civil War. Nixon, in turn, passed the involvement in Southeast Asia on to Gerald Ford, who had the misfortune of being president at the time of the humiliating climax, with the world witnessing photographs of the pitiful South Vietnamese clinging desperately to the last helicopter as it took off from the U.S. Embassy roof. Ford, who never had much luck, found himself in the position of inheriting Nixon's collapse. Well, Nixon, the only president ever to resign in disgrace, was permitted to re-emerge in later years in the posture of a world sage. Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, started out thinking he could depart from the Cold War consensus. A Sunday school teacher, a church deacon, Carter sought a moral compass for American foreign policy. A strong nation, like a strong person, he said, can afford to be gentle. To slow down the arms race, he put off development of a neutron bomb and a manned bomber, withdrew all U.S. nuclear weapons from South Korea, and in June 1979 flew to Vienna to sign the SALT II Treaty, restricting the building and deployment of strategic missiles. To deal with tragedies, such as the missing persons in Argentina, he established an Office of Human Rights under Assistant Secretary of State Pat Darien, now a resident of Chapel Hill. The first president to visit sub-Saharan Africa, he worked against the white supremacist regime in Rhodesia. To dispel the impression in Latin America that the United States was an overbearing Goliath, he signed 2 treaties, turning over control of the Panama Canal to the Republic of Panama, despite boisterous objections from Ronald Reagan and U.S. senators. Determined to bring peace to the Middle East, a goal no predecessor had achieved, Carter invited the President of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, to America. For nearly 2 weeks at Camp David, Carter moved from one man's cabin to the other, narrowing the differences between them, with the gratifying result that in September 1978, the 2 leaders signed the Camp Davis Accords, ending 30 years of hostilities. In his first months in office, Carter also reached out to the Kremlin in the hope of thawing the Cold War. But Soviet actions caused Carter to change direction. Incensed by the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, he withdrew the SALT II Treaty from consideration by the Senate, imposed an embargo on the shipment of grain to the USSR, announced a boycott of the Olympics scheduled in 1980 for Moscow. He also spent large sums on new warheads, cruise missiles, the MX, the nuclear-powered Trident submarine. But once Iranian militants seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held its occupants captive, none of these actions spared Carter from the accusation that he too was a passive leader. And in 1980 he went down to defeat when the country turned instead in yet another change of parties to the Republican Ronald Reagan. Of all the presidents in the half-century following World War II, none made as great a departure from his predecessors as did Reagan. In varying degrees, the presidents before him had sought, at least some of the time, some kind of accommodation with Russia. And Nixon, though he built his career on hostility to communism, had even traveled to mainland China, where he met with Mao at the Great Wall. Reagan, however, rejected the policy of détente. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire doomed to wind up in the ash heap of history. Moreover, unlike American policymakers in the past, he thought Soviet doom was imminent. I believe, he said, that communism is a sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages, even now, are being written. To speed the early demise of the Soviet Union, Reagan initiated a massive arms buildup. He also expanded the Cold War into new areas, notoriously Nicaragua, the venture that ended in the Iran-Contra scandal. Even when Gorbachev pursued policies of glasnost and perestroika, Reagan, at the Berlin Wall, voiced the melodramatic challenge: Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Yet Reagan, against the counsel of many of his advisors, who distrusted the Russian leader, eventually came to an understanding with Gorbachev and worked with him toward reducing armaments and easing the Cold War. In sum, Reagan, too, returned to détente, but in starkly different circumstances. When soon after Reagan left office, the Soviet Union imploded, Reagan's admirers claimed that the disintegration resulted from Reagan's decision to draw the USSR into a costly arms race it could not afford. Skeptics doubt that Reagan was so far-sighted, and they attribute the collapse to internal developments within the Soviet Union, a controversy that continues unabated today. Whatever one concludes about the controversy, it's clear that the world Reagan handed down to his successor, the first George Bush, was a very different place from the one Reagan had inherited 8 years before. When the Berlin Wall fell, Bush was very much in Reagan's shadow, the legatee of Reagan's policies. Yet contrarily, Reagan's very success left Bush in a new universe that Reagan had never known, and so permitted Bush to forge his own identity. At a summit meeting in Malta in 1989, Bush and Gorbachev declared an end to the Cold War. Thereafter, for the first time since 1945, an American president was called on to conduct foreign policy in a world that was no longer bipolar, but where novel crises emerged with little or no relationship to international communism. Abruptly, the past became irrelevant. The most conspicuous instance of this came after Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Bush put together a multinational coalition. The 96-hour war boosted Bush's approval rating to the highest that has ever been achieved by an American president. But not many months later, it resulted in his defeat for another term. In 1992, with the election of the Democrat Bill Clinton, he lost in no small part because, with the Cold War over, voters increasingly lost interest in foreign affairs and concentrated on Bush's domestic shortcomings. Contemplating the foreign policy of Bill Clinton brings to mind Churchill's remark after a dinner, "This pudding has no theme." That allusion is meant not as a criticism of Clinton so much as a description of the daunting array of problems he confronted. To be sure, there was some carryover from Bush in Iraq, in Somalia, in the NAFTA trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. For the most part, though, Clinton sailed in uncharted seas and in every part of the globe: North Korea, Haiti, Rwanda, Bosnia, Northern Ireland. And Clinton broke decisively with the past in visiting Hanoi. Clinton was also the first president to be preoccupied for most of his tenure with working out a strategy to cope with terrorism, a threat that often did not emerge, at least directly, from the actions of nation states with which diplomacy had hitherto been concerned. Only 5 weeks after Clinton took office in 1993, terrorists directed by Osama bin Laden launched the first attack on the World Trade Center, a car bomb placed in a parking garage. In 1998, bin Laden challenged Clinton again with simultaneous bombings of U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And in 2000, just 2 months before Clinton's term ended, a U.S. destroyer in the harbor of Aden was attacked. In trying to figure out how to function in this new universe of terrorism, the experience of presidents in the past was of no help. The tragedy of 9/11 brought that home vividly. I awakened on the morning of 9/11 in Prague, and not until late that afternoon, as I boarded a ship in Passau for a cruise on the Danube, that I learned what had happened minutes earlier at the World Trade Center. Over the ensuing days, the outpouring of sympathy in Europe was extraordinary. The next morning, aboard ship, I read in the front page and a headline of an Austrian newspaper, "Wir sind immer Amerikaner." When our ship reached Vienna, we found the parliament draped in black for mourning. And the radio on our bus from the harbor informed us that the whole city of Vienna was observing minutes of silence in memory of the American victims. At the U.S. Embassy in Bratislava, I saw wreaths of flowers piled so high that the embassy was almost inaccessible. It took the second George Bush little time to destroy nearly all of that goodwill. Though he had received fewer popular votes than his Democratic opponent in 2000, and clearly had no mandate for a classic revamping of American foreign policy, he brought into office with him a corps of neoconservative advisors who advocated unilateralism and justified preventive war. Even before 9/11, Bush had dismayed leaders of other nations by rejecting the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, and 3 months after 9/11, he withdrew the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Subsequently, the World Trade Organization censured the United States for the actions of the Bush administration in violating global trade law. And critics around the world denounced America for its denial of fundamental rights to detainees at Guantanamo. Finally, Bush evoked dissent at home and abroad for launching preventive war on Iraq, with the false claims that Iraq was a haven for al-Qaeda and that it had weapons of mass destruction. If the theme of the Cold War is largely one of continuity, though with important variations, the theme of recent years is primarily one of discontinuity. A scholar at Brookings has said of the change from the second Bush to Barack Obama, it's Mars and Venus. It's hard to find a more different contrast between presidents. Obama turned away so decisively from Bush's policies that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Skeptics, scoffing at the award, asked what Obama actually done. That question was not unreasonable, for he had not had time to do very much. From the outset, though, he had issued a series of edicts seeking to reverse the damage wrought by Bush. He ended the use of torture, withdrew combat troops in Iraq, ended the ban on U.S. funding of international organizations permitting abortions. Most important, he rejected the Bush doctrine of unilateralism. Early on, in visits to Ankara and Cairo, he reached out to the Muslim world. And later on, he negotiated an arms agreement with Russia and collaborated with Western European governments in Libya. Excuse me just a moment. I'm nearly done. But before getting carried away with the theme of discontinuity, let us remember that Obama also approved a surge of American forces in Afghanistan and chose the occasion pardon me, of his receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo to defend the resort to armed force. A nonviolent movement could not have stopped Hitler's armies, he said. Negotiation cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. Instead of softening this message, he said bluntly of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, some will kill, some will be killed. Moreover, despite his good intentions, Congress would not permit him, pardon me, either to make progress on global warming or to close down Guantanamo. Bear with me for one more paragraph. As Barack Obama begins a new term, he confronts a universe very different from the one Harry Truman inherited 2/3 of a century before. Some 40 years ago, when I held the Harmsworth Chair at Oxford, I co-taught a seminar with the Rhodes professor, Herbert Nicholas, who had written of the United States in 1945, as far as the free world was concerned, her shoulders held the sky suspended. Obama, though, has to conduct foreign relations with a keen awareness of how much more circumscribed American power has become. And in dealing with Syria and North Korea, with al-Qaeda and global warming over the next 4 years, it's not clear how much scope he's going to have for innovation. So then, a history of the last 67 years in fewer than that many minutes. A roadmap, I hope, to the scintillating lectures in Professor Laris's series that are yet to come in this room. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating and interesting survey of recent American foreign policy going back 60, 70 years. Thanks a lot. I think we all learned an awful lot and definitely gave us a good overview. I would like to open the floor for questions, as Professor Leuchtenberg has agreed kindly enough to answer as many questions as you have. Okay, please.
Yes, Professor. I have a question about your characterization of Kennedy as a Cold Warrior at the start of his term before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Given that he didn't escalate in Laos or support the failed American mission in Cuba, Is it possible that that was really just more rhetoric than actual policy, like you said with Eisenhower?
Yeah, no, I really don't think so. Though it's a reasonable question, and you're quite right about Laos. In fact, I had a sentence in this that I took out, realizing it was running long. He didn't buy that, but he had almost no interest in domestic policy. He was concerned with establishing American preeminence in the world as late as the Cuban Missiles Crisis, but it does take a turn after that. Yet even after the American University speech, he gives the Ich bin ein Berliner a speech in Germany, as I said, in Fort Worth, speaks in praise of the Green Berets and gives every indication he intends to keep on in Vietnam. Yes?
Two quick questions. One, you talked about the policies of containment versus being aggressive and trying to liberate. And I'm wondering if you think that the policy of waiting and allowing economic things to liberate people is more the long term, like the Chinese have, and intervening quickly is for Americans with little patience. In other words, maybe North Korea and Cuba would give a lie to that, but the fall of the Soviet Empire was really more through economics than invasion and so forth, and that we would be better off by waiting for peoples to be liberated by the economic developments of the free world. And the second one is, which of the presidents do you feel, and I was about to say grew more, but let's just say changed more in their outlook and policies as after entering office and seeing the realities? Yeah.
On the first, it's George Kennan, in developing the famous Article X in Foreign Affairs, and was thinking about a long time. Neither Kennan, despite the family tradition of familiarity with Russia, or anybody else, I believe, in the Truman period, thought that the downfall of the USSR would come as quickly as it did. And they had no clear notion about how it was going to come about, rather the sense that this was a system that could, for numbers of reasons, just couldn't hold together. And that if America put pressure on but avoided the direct conflict, that this would eventually prevail. On your second question, I really ought to have more time to think through a question like that, but I suppose Kennedy, despite my response to your question, probably changed the most of American presidents.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
Dick.
Bill, a brilliant survey, and I just want to return to the Kennedy for a moment, because while it's a wonderful characterization of him as a cold warrior, I believe it to be a bit incomplete in the following way, for which I ask you to respond to. And that is his great contribution, I think, in the Cold War was to stabilize the nuclear balance. That is, to push forward with the overhead space systems that could stabilize people on both sides realizing what the others were doing, to cap the number of strategic weapons that the United States would build and deploy, to pursue a second strike capability for the American nuclear deterrent so that it could be invulnerable. And I support this argument with a comment made to me once by Curtis LeMay, who said to me that it took him a while to figure out the Kennedy strategic doctrine. It was unilateral disarmament, to which I pretty near fainted dead away, wondering how he could come up with that. And then he explained that, in fact, we froze our enormous superiority over the Soviet Union and allowed them to catch up. And I thought that's exactly true. They never did quite catch up, and so that we were escalating against each other until many of those arms-controlled treaties. But it seems to me that that was a contribution in a certain way to peace.
Well, Dick, in any matters military, I'm not going to take you on, but defer to your greater knowledge. I think against the good points you're making is the way in which Kennedy in 1961 stirred up an arms race. I recall being a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford when everybody was talking literally about building shelters in their backyard. A very scary time. The reference to Curtis LeMay, I don't know if everybody knows who Curtis LeMay was. He's a man who advocated bombing Vietnam back to the Stone Age. And it is said that Curtis LeMay was the model for Dr. Strangelove.
Thank you. Mike.
Thank you for a terrific overview. Of all of the presidents you discussed, which one do you think was most successful in foreign affairs, and what do you think was the source of his success?
Well, I would say the most successful, with one exception, was Harry Truman. Given and the most innovative. The one really there are two things I think you can say against what I've just said. One is that Truman drew down the military budget, and at the same time indicated that the United States was not going to take very seriously what was happening in Korea, and then sent raw, green American boys into combat with unhappy results. The other is that by Truman's second term, there was a militarization of American policy that in the era of the Marshall Plan wasn't expected. That having been said, a quick answer to a question that needs more thought, I would say Truman.
Both Truman and Clinton started anew. They started at the beginning of a new era. But in a way, I wonder, didn't Truman have it a lot easier than Clinton? I thought you were perhaps a little bit unkind to Clinton in his very difficult task to actually come to terms with an entirely new era, while Truman had the clear enemy in front of him, and it was in a way easier conceptually, wasn't it?
If I gave that impression, then I was misunderstood. But the precise point I was making was making the remark about the pudding was that he faced an impossible situation where there were 8 or 10 different places in the world which he had to formulate policy with no tradition that he'd be able to follow. Unkind, I never mean to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to join with everyone else, Bill, in thanking for this wonderful overview with all your insight. I want to ask you a little bit more about the theory that Reagan consciously brought about the fall of the Soviet Union. I was always struck, and continue to be struck, by the fact that the people who advanced that theory are the same people who in 1989 and 1991 said that the fall of communism was all a hoax and that we shouldn't believe any of it, and that communism hadn't gone anywhere, that what we needed was more and more rearmament and the Cold War continuing. They only came very slowly to the realization that something had actually happened. How do you account for how they can get away with that?
Well, as someone who, as you know, has always been a political activist, I try once I get to the podium to be balanced in presentation. But you, I must say, I'm as you are, unpersuaded by that.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
So I was hoping to follow up on your answer to Mike Morgan's question about Truman, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about Korea, and particularly its the role of the politics of the Korean War in both the transition between Truman and Eisenhower, and in fact in the campaign in 1952. And so specifically, I was wondering if you could comment on how close Truman might have actually been to going for another term, and the extent to which you think Eisenhower won on the strength of not having taken the country into the Korean War, and how the politics played out in Eisenhower's victory over Stevenson.
The Republican slogan in 1952 was a chemical formula: K1C2, Korea, communism, and corruption. And when Nixon left office, he was more unpopular than any president in our history. Slightly more unpopular than Nixon was when he was driven out of office. So it was a matter of Truman at times would say that, pardon me, he wanted to run again, but it was an illusion. There was never an impossibility.
Lloyd, several people have asked you about what you think the greatest, or which president had the greatest success. I wonder if you look at American foreign policy since the late 1940s, what do you think is the greatest mistake, the greatest misunderstanding that has characterized American foreign policy during those various presidencies? Would it be Vietnam? I don't want to put, you mentioned Vietnam several times, but it didn't seem to be the only thing. What is it?
Certainly not. The field is so rich. to pick from. Gosh. Did you no, please, why don't you?
No.
Anyone wants to grab this?
I want to learn from the past.
That is a sign of an experienced lecturer who passes on the question back to the audience. That's always a good tactic. I like to do it myself.
I thought you perhaps wanted to say something.
No, I wanted to leave the answer to you.
Yes.
Cheney says that after Nixon, the imperial presidency went into decline because Congress took over too much power from the president, and so the object was to regain that. What do you think about the rise and fall of the imperial presidency and where we are now in that?
Well, I think probably the farthest reach, Natalie, of the imperial presidency was the second Bush and some of his advisors who claimed that there was no constraint whatsoever on the American presidency. Obama does not seem to hold to that same view, but I notice that it's being suggested, has been over the past month or so, that the Republican opposition in Congress is so great that he may decide to draw upon executive powers of dubious foundation because that's the only way anything can get done. And critics would certainly regard that as imperial when it comes to that.
Thank you. Yes, please.
One of the points you touched on later is the theme of current discontinuity in American foreign policy, certainly between presidents, almost in contrast to how Eisenhower came in sort of deriding containment, but then continued many of Truman's policies and sort of acting with a more real policy fashion. And so my question is, how much do you see that continuing in sort of more of a discontinuous age where each president will sort of attempt to fashion their own foreign policy, or more of a continuous policy as we saw towards the beginning of the Cold War?
Yeah, well, I think it's likely in the 21st century that there are going to be more discontinuities between presidents than was true earlier, when you had or appeared to have a monolithic enemy which meant that you were only changing in degree in your attitude toward coping with that enemy. Now the situation is considerably more diverse, and I would think we're going to see less continuity than we have.
So would you actually agree with Henry Kissinger himself, who said that we are going back to the 19th century, that the Cold War was an aberration? Now we're going back of a concert of nations and conflicts of nation states, plus of course the danger of terrorism, international terrorism.
I've never been known to agree with Henry Kissinger.
And on this occasion? Right, then let me ask you a final question before we finish tonight. It's always fun to speculate. Think about Barack Obama's second term in office, the Asian pivot, the focus on China, maybe a certain neglect of Europe and the old allies. Do you think that is going to continue, or where is Obama's second term going? What do you think?
Well, I was struck even by the in the inaugural address that foreign affairs were not central. Unlike, for example, Kennedy's inaugural address, where there's only a single sentence on domestic policy, more like FDR's in 1933, when there's only a single sentence on foreign policy. I don't think that's what's foremost in his mind. I think he's concerned with a range of other issues, which doesn't mean that he can run and hide or that these crises are not going to develop. But it's hard to see where a new policy, how a new policy has been articulated, and with the changeover of personnel in the government, that increases the sense that there may not yet be a coherent policy that we can point to.
Thank you very much. In 4 years' time, we will ask you back to comment on Obama's second term. Thank you very much. Thanks again for coming tonight. I would like to point out before you all leave that the next lecture in our Ambassadors Forum is actually Ambassador Rika of the State Department in DC, who will talk about the Balkans on January 29. And the next lecture in this series will be a talk about George Kennan and Russia on February the 7th in this very room. You're all very welcome to come. We have a mailing list here, an email mailing list. If you haven't signed up, please do that. And there are also flyers flying about here. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you.